In 1933, Lucky Luciano did something that stunned the American underworld. He turned his back on a powerful Italian associate, Dutch Schultz, and stepped in to protect Bumpy Johnson, a Harlem boss who wasn't Italian, wasn't part of the commission, and wasn't supposed to matter. To many, it looked like a personal choice. To others, it looked like weakness. In reality, it was neither. That decision wasn't driven by loyalty, race, or sentiment. It was driven by something far colder: survival of the system. Harlem wasn't just territory. It was a pressure point. A single spark there could ignite a gang war that would drag in police, politicians, newspapers, and eventually the federal government. And once that happened, everyone lost. Dutch Schultz didn't see it that way. He saw Harlem as a prize, a market to be taken by force before Prohibition ended and his bootlegging empire collapsed. Guns, numbers, intimidation, the old formula that had always worked for him. What he didn't understand was that the rules had changed, and he was the only one still playing the old game. Lucky Luciano understood those new rules better than anyone alive. He knew that power wasn't about how much violence you could unleash, it was about knowing when violence became bad for business. And when Dutch crossed that line, he didn't just threaten Bumpy Johnson. He threatened the entire structure Luciano had spent years building. What followed wasn't a street war or a public showdown. It was a quiet decision made behind closed doors, a phone call, a warning, a line drawn. One man was protected, another was isolated, and once isolated, his fate was sealed. This is the story of the moment Lucky Luciano chose stability over loyalty, structure over ego, and why that choice ended Dutch Schultz's reign forever. In 1933, Harlem wasn't just another neighborhood on a mob map. It was a self-contained economy, a tightly balanced system where money moved daily through small bets, handwritten ledgers, and trusted runners. The numbers game wasn't a side racket, it was the financial bloodstream of the community. Rent, food, favors, protection, all of it flowed through those operations. And whoever disrupted that flow didn't just challenge a gangster, they destabilized an entire ecosystem. At the center of that system stood Bumpy Johnson. To outsiders, he was just another local operator. Inside Harlem, he was something else entirely. Bumpy didn't rule through chaos. He enforced discipline. Collectors were paid on time. Violence was controlled, not theatrical. Problems with police were handled quietly. More importantly, Harlem's numbers operations under Bumpy didn't prey on the community, they integrated with it. This was not how most Italian crime families operated. Their model was conquest. Take territory, replace leadership, extract profit. Harlem didn't function that way. Its numbers racket depended on trust, familiarity, and daily participation from people who knew exactly who they were dealing with. You couldn't just replace that overnight with outsiders carrying bats and guns. That distinction mattered, and it was exactly what Dutch Schultz failed to understand. By 1933, Schultz was under pressure. Prohibition was collapsing, and with it the bootlegging empire that had made him rich. He needed a replacement income stream, something stable, cash-based, and less visible to federal scrutiny. The numbers racket looked perfect. He'd already forced his way into parts of the Bronx and Brooklyn. Harlem was the final prize. But Harlem wasn't empty territory. It had leadership, structure, and lines that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. When Schultz's men rolled in, it wasn't negotiation, it was occupation. Doors smashed, collectors beaten, messages delivered with fists instead of words. To Schultz, this was leverage. To Harlem, it was an invasion. Bumpy Johnson saw the math immediately. He didn't have the manpower to win a straight fight. 15 loyal soldiers against dozens of seasoned enforcers wasn't resistance, it was suicide. But surrender wasn't an option either. If Harlem folded once, it would never belong to its people again. This wasn't just a dispute between criminals. It was a collision between two incompatible systems. One built on force, the other on balance. And the moment Schultz brought violence into Harlem, he unknowingly invited a third party into the equation, someone who cared far less about territory and far more about what unchecked violence would cost everyone. That's when the phone rang. By 1933, Dutch Schultz wasn't expanding because he was confident, he was expanding because he was cornered. Prohibition had built his empire, but everyone could see the end coming. Repeal was no longer a rumor. It was policy in motion. When alcohol went legal, Dutch's cash machine would shut off overnight. He needed a replacement fast, and he needed one that didn't depend on borders, trucks, or imported supply. The numbers racket looked perfect. It ran on pennies and dimes, generated steady daily cash, and operated in a legal gray zone that federal agents largely ignored. Most importantly, it was local. No warehouses, no shipments, no long trails to follow. Schultz had already proven that brute force could crack open numbers operations elsewhere. Harlem, to him, was just the last and biggest prize. What Dutch didn't grasp was timing, not calendar timing, but system timing. The underworld had changed since the worst days of prohibition violence. The commission existed precisely to stop men like Schultz from starting wars that brought heat on everyone. Expansion wasn't supposed to be decided with bats and guns anymore. It was supposed to be voted on, negotiated, contained. Dutch ignored all of that. He didn't ask, he didn't wait. He moved first, fast, and publicly. That decision revealed the real problem. Schultz didn't believe the rules applied to him. He saw the commission as a suggestion, not a structure. As long as money flowed his way, he assumed the rest would fall in line. This wasn't ambition, it was panic disguised as confidence. The more aggressive Dutch became, the more isolated he grew. Other bosses didn't see a bold move, they saw a liability. A man willing to trigger a race-based gang war in Harlem wasn't just threatening Bumpy Johnson, he was threatening headlines, police pressure, and federal intervention that would shut down every racket in the city. That's what made his Harlem invasion different from past takeovers. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't surgical. It was loud enough to force everyone else to pick a side. And that's when the problem stopped being about Harlem. Because once Dutch crossed that line, he wasn't challenging Bumpy Johnson anymore. He was challenging the authority of Lucky Luciano and the system Luciano had built to keep men like Dutch from burning everything down. Dutch believed violence would secure his future. Lucky understood that unchecked violence would destroy it. That difference, panic versus structure, would decide what happened next. When violence spills faster than money can clean it up, power moves away from the men holding the guns. Harlem reached that point within hours. Word traveled block by block, not as rumor but as warning. Outsiders were breaking doors, collectors were bleeding, and the numbers Harlem's daily pulse were being disrupted by force. That kind of disruption doesn't stay local. It invites police, reporters, politicians. And once they arrive, nobody controls the narrative. Stephanie Street. Claire understood this better than anyone. She didn't command soldiers, she commanded flow. Money, information, influence kept moving, kept balanced. Schultz's incursion wasn't just a threat to territory, it was a threat to equilibrium. If Harlem erupted, the damage wouldn't stop at 125th Street. It would ripple outward, hardening every badge and tightening every courtroom. So, she didn't rally men. She made a call. The question she put forward wasn't emotional, and it wasn't pleading. It was structural. Was the system going to hold, or was one man's panic about the future going to set fire to everything? That framing mattered, because it forced the issue into a place where it couldn't be ignored. Responsibility. On the other end of the line sat Lucky Luciano, the one figure positioned to stop a war without starting another. Luciano didn't need a report. He needed confirmation. Who moved first? How loudly? And whether permission had been asked. The answers pointed in a single direction. This wasn't an accident. This was a rogue play. That distinction changed everything. The commission existed to prevent exactly this public, destabilizing force that threatened every operation in the city. Schultz hadn't just violated etiquette, he'd violated the premise. He treated rules as optional and consequences as negotiable. Luciano saw the math instantly. Allow the takeover and accept chaos as precedent, or draw a line and enforce it once quietly, decisively. The call didn't end with promises or alliances, it ended with a task: pull the men out, now. No speeches, no optics, just reversal. Because reversals, when they happen quickly, signal authority better than threats ever could. What followed wasn't theater. It was compliance under pressure, cars leaving blocks they'd claimed hours earlier, doors closing without celebration, the absence of gunfire doing more to restore order than any show of force. Harlem exhaled not because it had won, but because disaster had been deferred. In that moment, the balance tipped. Not toward Harlem alone, and not against Schultz personally, but toward a principle. Violence that endangers the system forfeits protection from it. And once a man loses that protection, he stops being powerful. He becomes exposed. That was the real consequence of the call, not a betrayal, but a reclassification. From the outside, it looked like a personal betrayal. Lucky Luciano had known Dutch Schultz for years. They weren't close friends, but they were aligned by convenience, profit, and shared enemies. Turning against Dutch to protect Bumpy Johnson seemed to violate the unspoken code of ethnic solidarity that had long defined Italian organized crime. But Luciano wasn't thinking in terms of loyalty. He was thinking in terms of containment. By 1933, Luciano had spent years trying to eliminate exactly this kind of behavior: random expansion, public violence, one man's ambition dragging everyone else into trouble. The commission wasn't built to reward the strongest gangster, it was built to restrain the most dangerous one. And in that moment, Dutch Schultz wasn't just dangerous to Harlem, he was dangerous to the entire structure. If Luciano backed Dutch, he would be endorsing a new rule. Territory could be taken by force, without approval, without limits. That precedent would have been catastrophic. Every ambitious boss would follow it. Every neighborhood would become a battleground. The fragile balance that kept police pressure manageable would collapse overnight. Luciano understood something Dutch never did. Authority only works if it's enforced consistently. If the rules protected some men and not others, then they weren't rules at all. They were suggestions. And suggestions don't survive panic. This is why Luciano's decision was so cold and so final. He didn't threaten Dutch with violence. He threatened him with isolation, with votes, with the loss of legitimacy. In a system Luciano designed, being cut off from approval was worse than being attacked. It meant no allies, no arbitration, no protection when consequences arrived. Dutch believed pulling out of Harlem would make him look weak. Luciano saw the opposite. Refusing to pull out would expose him as uncontrollable. And, in a structure built on predictability, uncontrollable men don't last long. By choosing to protect Bumpy Johnson's operation, Luciano wasn't endorsing Harlem's independence out of sympathy. He was reinforcing a principle. Economic stability mattered more than personal pride. Harlem was functioning. Dutch's invasion was not. One contributed to order, the other invited chaos. That choice marked the point of no return for Dutch Schultz. Not because Luciano declared war on him, but because he stopped shielding him from the consequences of his own behavior. And in the underworld, once that shield is gone, time becomes your enemy. After Harlem, Dutch Schultz was no longer just another powerful operator. He was a problem everyone now saw clearly and quietly stepped away from, not because he had lost his muscle, but because he had lost protection. In a system built on shared restraint, that loss is fatal. Schultz didn't adapt, he escalated. Cut off from expansion and increasingly boxed in by his own paranoia, Dutch began acting as if force alone could restore relevance. He made threats that crossed lines even hardened bosses avoided. He drew attention where discretion was survival. Each move reinforced the same conclusion across the city: Dutch couldn't be contained, and an uncontrollable variable threatens every calculation. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson did the opposite. He consolidated quietly. Operations normalized, money flowed without interruption. Harlem stayed calm. No headlines, no sirens, no reason for outsiders to intervene. In the language of the underworld, that outcome spoke louder than loyalty ever could. This contrast mattered. It clarified the lesson Lucky Luciano had been enforcing all along. Power that preserves stability earns tolerance. Power that invites chaos forfeits it. Luciano didn't need to punish Dutch publicly. He only needed to let the system apply its own logic. Once that happened, events accelerated without his visible involvement. Dutch's isolation grew, allies stopped returning calls, mediators disappeared. Options narrowed. In criminal hierarchies, this is the most dangerous phase, not the moment of confrontation, but the quiet stretch where doors close one by one. When Schultz finally fell, it wasn't framed as betrayal or revenge, it was treated as resolution. A liability removed, business continuing, no speeches, no celebrations, just the absence of a man who had pushed too far, too loudly, for too long. For Bumpy Johnson, the outcome was longevity. Decades of control, not earned through domination, but through balance. For Luciano, it was validation. His decision in 1933 proved that enforcing structure once cleanly and decisively could prevent countless wars later. And that's the part most people miss. This wasn't a story about choosing sides, it was about choosing rules. Luciano didn't save Bumpy because he favored him. He didn't abandon Dutch out of spite. He enforced a principle. Anyone who endangers the system loses the system's protection. In the end, that principle mattered more than any alliance. Because in organized crime, as in any power structure, the most dangerous moment isn't when someone betrays you, it's when the rules stop protecting them. From the outside, the story is often reduced to a single phrase: Lucky Luciano betrayed Dutch Schultz. It sounds dramatic, personal, final, but that framing misses the point entirely. What Lucky Luciano did in 1933 wasn't betrayal, it was enforcement. He didn't turn on Dutch out of preference for Bumpy Johnson, nor out of sentiment or ideology. He acted because a line had been crossed, and that line held the entire system together. Once violence threatened to pull Harlem into open war, the issue stopped being about territory or loyalty. It became about survival, not of one man, but of the structure that kept everyone rich and out of prison. Dutch Schultz believed power meant freedom of action, that as long as he had guns and money, rules could be bent or ignored. Luciano understood the opposite. Real power is restraint, and rules only matter when they're applied to everyone. The moment Dutch tested that boundary and refused to step back, he removed himself from protection. Everything that followed was consequence, not conspiracy. Bumpy Johnson survived because he operated within balance. Dutch fell because he rejected it, and Luciano emerged as the figure who proved that control doesn't come from domination, but from knowing when to stop someone before chaos becomes irreversible. That's why this story still matters. Not because one man died violently, the underworld was full of violent endings. It matters because it shows how systems decide who belongs and who doesn't. You don't get eliminated the moment you make enemies. You get eliminated the moment you become unmanageable. In the end, Lucky Luciano didn't choose sides. He chose order over ego, stability over fear, rules over men who thought they were bigger than them. And in worlds built on power, that choice is always the one that lasts.